have joined us, even though tomorrow we have a holiday which is coming. And I thank all for taking your time, for spending your time so that we can discuss this very important topic. The basic reason why we are this topic is basically because of one project which is basically done by the KUHAS, or the university which you are enrolled in. The university has brought up many issues about substance use problem among our students, not only in our college, but in a lot of colleges, including medical college and also other professional colleges. As budding doctors, we have to be aware of what substance use are big. But before I go into what is substance abuse, what I would like to say is I would like to begin by making you understand what is basically neuroscience. So I'll be starting with what neuroscience is. Just one moment. So I'll just start with what is neuroscience, and I hope this screen is visible to you all. Now, we all know that, is the screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We all know that the brain, which we are dealing with, the brain is the basic of what makes us human. Brain is the most complex organ in the human system. It is highly developed. It's still evolving. Create emotions and express those emotions, and also to perceive what is going on in the environment, so that we can create an internal map of what is going on in the external world. So these three things are the basic important functions of the mind. And when I'm talking about the mind, I'm basically talking about the brain itself. So your thoughts, your emotions, your perceptions, all are created in different areas of the brain, which helps us to understand where we are living, the surroundings we are living in, how we can interact with our surroundings, and also how we can modify the way we interact so that we can change the way the surroundings will perceive us. So this is how our brain is. And so whenever we are communicating with another human being, we are actually trying to communicate with the brain of that person, the thoughts, emotions, and perceptions of that person. So that is the basic understanding of neuroscience. This structure of the brain is actually formed, this is something which you all know, this is actually formed by small neurons, small tiny neurons, and we have a large amount of neurons which forms multiple synapses, and that forms the whole structure of the brain. So if you're looking at this ultra-structured brain, it is actually a circuitry of multiple neurons which are sending signals to and fro, so that it controls the whole of the brain system and also the whole of the human organ or human being as such. So the brain can be hypothesized as a computer, rather a supercomputer, which is having an immense power of calculation, an immense speed and all. So the basic structure is basically the neuron itself. Even though the brain is such a sensitive and such a wonderful organ, if you're looking at the ultra structure, it is 75% made of water, just plain water. It is a painless organ. That is why we do neurosurgeries without any kind of anesthesia, except for opening the skull. And the funniest part is, even though the brain is such a complex organ, it is a highly energy dependent structure, so that it cannot even survive without oxygen for about 4 to 6 minutes. So if you're going for a hypoxia, you cannot survive. Your brain will not be able to tolerate that hypoxia even for 5 minutes, and your brain will be dead. The brain will cease to function, and there will be complete dysfunction of the brain structure. But that is not the case with any other organs in our human body. Most of our organs may survive for much more longer time without oxygen supply. So that is a sensitivity of the brain, and that shows how complex our brain structure is. Now, we all know that the brain is divided into the right and left lobes, and there are different functional localizations for each of these lobes. Now, these are all basically coming under experimental neurosciences, where we can say that the left brain, which functions, important functions of the left brain, basically being calculations, reasoning, spoken language. We all know about the Wernicke's area and the Broca's, also required for the right side control, right hand control. Said this about the left brain. If you're looking at the right brain, this is also very important because it helps us to form mental images. It helps us in imagination, for musical awareness. So people who are having a good talent to music or musical instruments, it's said that their right brain is more developed. So even though we have a single structure called as a brain, we have two hemispheres, and each of these hemispheres are having specific functions. So a particular human being can only be complete if both these hemispheres are acting in unison, and that is the basic important thing which we all have to understand. A person can survive without right brain, but there will be some functional deficits. Similar is the case of left brain dysfunction. And one of the funniest part is, I know if you're remembering back about your embryology, your neural systems or your nervous system basically starts to begin even before the fetus, even before the mother is aware that she is pregnant, because most of the neural formation, especially from the notochord, the neural crest, and all happens in the first 3 weeks of action. That is, it's only after that that even the mother will understand that that particular person is pregnant. And even the neuronal structure forms in the first 1 month or first 3 weeks of pregnancy. The development of the brain takes actually longer. Now, one of the important findings which we have is you will never have the number of neurons in your brain that will never be preserved. Actually, the number of neurons actually declines when you age. That is because, the basic example which I give to all of your students is: have you seen the first mobile phone which was developed by Motorola? It is a very big mobile phone. It is actually weighing around a few kilos. It's just a brick. But what about the mobile phones which we use now? It's much more smaller. It weighs close to maybe 200, 300 grams, and it is having much energy efficient, more functionally specific organ. So neuronal pruning is one thing which is always there in neuroscience. Now, if you're looking at the functional divisions of the brain, what I talked about till now is basically the structure, ultrastructure of the brain, and the division of the brain into different hemispheres. Now, if you're looking at the functional divisions of the brain as functions, it is divided into something called as a thinking brain and also the emotional brain. Now, among this, can anyone tell me which is the oldest? Is it the emotional brain or the thinking brain? Okay, so the thinking brain is the newest add-on, while emotional brain is something which has been there since evolution, because we all tend to think in an emotional way. But to think in a logical way, we require the adequate functioning of a developed brain. That is why animals also express emotions, but they generally don't. We don't tell that the animals think and act. They are expressing by emotion. That is why we can train an animal. But the human being is able to think logically. So that is why we say that the thinking brain is the newest add-on. If you're looking at the evolution, the thinking brain is the newest add-on compared to the emotional brain. And there are different functions of thinking brain. The thinking brain or your brain helps us in planning things, organizing, executing things, and also monitoring whether this execution is normal or not, or should we modify the execution in some way or not. So that is what a thinking brain does. But what an emotional brain does is it tries to explore the environment. It may not think, it just tries to explore, it tries to experiment with new things, it tries to socialize with the surroundings. So, in an emotional brain, the logical sequencing is actually not there. Rather, it tries to socialize, it tries to mingle, it tries to explore the situation, it tries to experiment. While the thinking brain actually thinks logically, it tries to plan, it tries to organize, it tries to monitor what is happening in the surroundings. So, as I told you earlier, the emotional brain is the first to develop, and later came the thinking brain. Now, coming on to addictions. Now, before I go into addiction proper, what I would say is uh, I will just try to show you a video. Just 1 second before I click on the video. Yeah. Hope you could all see the video. Can
Yes, sir.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Can anyone tell me what you just saw, or can anyone describe the gist of the video?
Sir, sir, I think at first, any kind of addiction begins like some kind of experimentation on seeing something new. So after using it, if one feels happy or if he or she feels like what it it's something like a stress relief or something, then uh, they will be tempted more to use it and more often. But ultimately, it will lead to their own destruction.
Yeah, yeah. So what you told is actually right. Like most of the addictions, it actually starts as experimentation. Most. I'm not saying that every addiction starts as experimentation, but most of the addictions start as experimentation. What is happening in addiction? Addiction is basically a behavior, a behavior pattern in which I told you about the two functional areas of the brain. That is, we have the thinking brain and the emotional brain. Now, addiction is a behavior pattern in which what happens is your emotional brain actually hijacks your thinking brain. That is what is happening. Now, you have your emotional brain. Usually, it is under control by your thinking brain. It is something called as a top-down control, which we have. So, in neuroscience, we have something called as a top-down control and bottom-up control. So, I'll give you an example. Like you might have heard of something called as the extensor plantar response. Now, why should a person develop an extensor plantar response when there is a cortical lesion, or whenever there is the upper motor neuron lesion? Why? Because the top-down control is basically lost because of the stroke, and that is why the patient gets a primitive reflex, which is called as extensor plantar response. Now, when this top-down control is intact, you generally get something called as a flexor plantar response. So that is a concept called as a top-down control and the bottom-up control. Now, usually what happens is you have your brain, you have your limbic circuitry, which is an important circuit. If you're remembering your physiology days, you have the limbic system, you have the Pappas circuit, and in the limbic system, you have a particular area called as the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is typically a part of the basal ganglia system, but it comes into the extended limbic system area. So this nucleus accumbens is which is actually belonging to the ventral striatum, is the area which actually gives you the response of something called as pleasure. Now, what happens is whenever in this system, in this area, you have the substantia nigra. You have the substantia nigra here, and whenever you are going in for a pleasure-seeking activity, what happens is we have a lot of pleasurable feeling. That is the pleasure which you have. That is what is shown in that video in the initial part. The kiwi was walking. The kiwi saw this yellow thing, which the kiwi is not sure whether it is good or bad. So the kiwi started trying to move it, try to taste it or smell it, and then it tried it eat it actually took it inside. And once it took it inside, it got that pleasurable feeling, and that in basic neuroscience is called as the reward system, or the activation of reward system by the dopamine or dopamine neurotransmitter when it is released from the substantia nigra to the nucleus accumbens. Technically, this is basically the bottom-up control, and usually when you get your frontal lobe, the frontal cortex, which is the component of your thinking brain, it is having a top-down control over this reward system, so that it will control the reward system so that it will not proceed, or your reward actually will not proceed, and your emotional brain will be under control. So whenever you are getting a pleasure, you get that pleasure, you enjoy it, but that is controlled by your top-down control from the prefrontal cortex. So that is what happens whenever you are using any kind of pleasurable activity. But what happens is that when you are frequently, or when you are trying to stimulate dopamine release into the reward pathway by using artificial means. Artificial means basically psychoactive substances. Now, what's on the brain? So that is why these are all called psychoactive substances. So whenever you are using any kind of psychoactive substance, you are actually artificially trying to stimulate the reward system, increase the outflow of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens. This increase of outflow of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens will not be able to, this increased outflow cannot be controlled by your prefrontal cortex. So what happens? You get that pleasure, you get that reward, you get completely immersed in that reward, and in order to gain that reward, you try to again seek that substance. So it starts as an X, then slowly it goes into a drug-seeking behavior. So in this slide, what I have described is the factors which are contributing to addiction. But the most important factor which we all find is, first you start to experiment, then you go in for peer pressure, because many of our friends, when they use it, you understand what is the effect these substances can have on them. For example, most of our friends, especially when I was studying, when my friends used to use the substances, what they get is they get this high. They start to talk with everyone. They start to mingle with everyone. So you get that cue. Okay, when I'm using this substance, I can socialize more, and that lead on to further drug-seeking behavior, especially. It could be because to experiment, it could be to avoid social rejection. So if you can say when you are using a drug, you will very well use that. Some actually, especially those people who are adventurous, they try to use a drug or substance as testing their limits. Some just use it to improve their mood. For example, if you are getting into stress because of the workload, the amount of sometimes we may go in for this substance use behavior, and also to receive social rewards. That the basic social reward is to get into company with others who use all these substances. So a thing which starts as an experimental use, you finally it results in something called as a drug-seeking behavior. What happens when you have the drug-seeking behavior? Then all your focus into the kiwi. When it started using this substance regularly, it was not getting the previous high. And that is something called as development of tolerance. Your brain starts to develop tolerance to these substances, so that you will never get, or you no longer get the amount of high which you used to get with that amount of substance. So in order to get the high, what a person will do, the person will increase the amount of substances. That is one thing which a person can do. Or the person may switch substances. For example, a person who started using beer, now to get that high, because when a person develops tolerance to beer, he slowly switches from beer or from hard liquor to cannabis, or from cannabis to cocaine. So that is how the development of tolerance will lead on to switching of substances. Another scientific terminology for this is the gateway phenomenon. You start with one drug, which is the gateway or portal of entry to substance use problem, and then you finally end up in a lot able to survive even without using the substance. If you have noticed one thing in the kiwi video, in that video, what it depicts is, once the kiwi is taking that substance, in spite of understanding that substance is doing harm to that kiwi. The kiwi was falling down, it was injuring itself, but in spite of understanding all those, the drug-seeking behavior was much more higher. That basically shows that the emotional thinking was much more higher compared to the logical thinking. Inherence is very rampant. Get access to inherence. Example, the normal petrol or diesel can be used. We now get hard substances or hard synthetic substances like methamphetamine, crystal meth, all these, it's very rampant in our community now. Maybe because of the lockdown, maybe because all these substances, they are only required in a very small amount for getting that high. Now, it's not only the chemical substances, there are certain behaviors which can also be addictive. For example, increased screen time or something called as problematic screen time. Now, use of TV is an old-fashioned thing which was there in my when I was of your age, but now it's internet, and we don't say that it as mobile addiction or internet addiction anymore. We basically say it as abnormal usage of screen time or excessive screen time. Another concept is addiction to sexual activities. So all these behaviors can also have an addictive potential. Now, what we have to understand is starts early itself. For example, if you're looking, this is from a study which was done in US, especially for first-time marijuana users who were seeking de-addiction treatment. And most of these people, they started using marijuana or tetrahydrocannabinol at around when they were there. 7% started using in their teens, and 26% started using when they were young adults. What we have to understand is when a person is using a substance in their in their teens, that is at 15 years or 16 years, the brain is still pruning, this brain is still developing, and that creates a lot of damage to the brain. What has been seen in most of the experience and most of the studies is any person who starts using substance early in their lifetime, they have a high potential for developing dependence on that drug or on that substance. They have a very high potential for brain damage secondary to those substances, and it is very difficult for those people who are having early drug use to quit that substance compared to people who are using or initiating the use of the drugs or substances in the adult age. This academic failure, poor impulse control, lack of knowledge or attitude towards substance use. For example, if a person, I give you an example of a person who is having a adventure-seeking attitude, so he may start experimenting on that substance. There are a lot of environmental factors which can be conflicts in the society or in the surrounding, conflicts at home, peer pressure, modeling behavior. My father is using a substance, so he is not having problems. I also start using substance. Or any of your role models are using a particular substance, you start to use just following that person's path. Accessibility is one of the important problems whenever we are dealing with addiction. But what we have to understand is all these are factors which actually is perpetuating an addiction process. Addiction is also having a genetic addiction. It was shown that people who are having a diagnosis of alcohol dependence, their children is having a higher percent increased risk of developing any substance use. It's not only alcohol, it can be anything else also, and they have a high chance of developing it at a very young age itself. So it is the addiction process is having its own genetic underpinnings. It could be triggered or it could be perpetuated by all other environmental, social, and personal factors. So these are certain domains, especially understanding the risk factors. For example, we generally divide it into the risk factor. For example, the aggressive behavior is a risk factor which is there in the individual. The measure which we have to do is something called as self-control. So you have to make the child understand aggression, or person understand that aggression is not the way to deal with a stress. So we have to practice self-control. Similarly, substance use among friends. The domain is the peer group or the peer relation. So here the change of attitude among peers, among the person and among peers is required to bring about an understanding or awareness of substance use problem, and also to take steps to prevent a substance use problem. So these are the certain facts which we have to understand. Addiction, if it is not initiated by 21 years, it is unlikely to be initiated for life. That is one of the important findings which we have from India itself. And age of initiation is inversely proportional to addiction. So the younger your age of initiation, the more will be your addiction or severity of addiction. And adolescent is the highest risk. That is the age till around 20 years is the highest risk period for any on the onset of any kind of addiction. And these people, in order to get out of this problem of addiction, but the best thing is you have to be professional. You have to make other people